I'm curious if any of the writers or artists address issues of overload. And I think about facts, and I think about our current news cycle, the idea that we see so much, we see and hear so much that maybe, well, you actually touched upon a word, anesthetics, but I'm guessing you actually meant the opposite of aesthetics as opposed to being anesthetized.
No, I actually meant anesthetize.
Oh, you did? Okay.
Yes, I did mean anesthetize.
What about the
I'm not sure I spelled that word right, but I mean it as a little bit of a pun on.
Okay, I didn't know where you're going with that, but
okay.
what about the idea
I have to do that in the
too
English
much
department.
exposure
Well,
creates
yes.
lots of awareness?
So, two answers to that. Number one, Susan Sontag was very much a student of the German philosophers of the early part of the century, like George Simmel, for instance, who understood precisely that modern life was extremely overstimulating and that it produced actually affectless and numbness. And there's a much bigger thing in Susan Buck-Morse's article that I referenced about that as well. Susan Sontag talked about it, the overproduction and overstimulation of late capitalism, although she wouldn't have said late, but the capitalist regime of production of sensation constantly overloaded our senses. This is one of the reasons for her that she wants to slow you down and get back to the touching, tasting, feeling, and not have it all be visual. So her whole book on photography ends with an ecology of photographs, where she basically says we have to cut back on the photograph. We have too many photographs, which is more or less a silly idea, because that's not really going to happen. But she was very concerned about the overloading of the senses, the numbness that got produced by that, and retraining the senses through, at least in the 60s, I think this is true, it's probably true all the way along, through a more vigorous engagement with a more high art. Now, she's known for flipping that, turning the high art, low art thing upside down and over again, but she really thought arts and arts practice was a way to reawaken and retrain the senses and reshape consciousness. So Hannah Arendt, in The Life of the Mind, has really no answer, but her answer is really time. It's like you have to let painful feelings subside. So she's not really talking about overstimulation in the way that Susan Sontag has, but Sontag certainly saw what we experience now as already on the horizon in the 1960s.
Sounds like the idea that of food in restaurants, Fridays gives you huge portions, and the criticism is that that's what it's fulfilling in a market for profitability for them to supply you a lot of food. And if you go to super fancy, highly expensive restaurants, you have these tasting menus. These little bits.
Well, there is, right, yeah. Sontag in the 60s was very determined not to let the, so there's a quite loud argument about mass culture from the war, really from the pre-war era, pre-World War II, interwar years, up through the 60s, about the deadliness of mass culture and how it deadens the senses and pre-programs you to having certain kinds of relations. You see this in the New York intellectuals or among the Frankfurt School. And Sontag was much more skeptical that we experienced, let's say, popular culture, mass culture, as such unthinking, manipulable drones. But she did see that the massive production of sensation in our life as having a very dangerous effect on our capacity to engage the world and think about the world. So it's not just large portions, it's lots of large portions, right? It's a kind of never-ending sensorium. The cities are like that.
I kind of want to hear more about morality, which I feel like was touched upon, and how to do ethics without empathy. And so we're saying these ladies were very illuminating about how to get at the truth and look at facts that are disruptive. Okay, then what? Like if we say we want to look at facts and aim towards what's right, what's good, or I don't know, a little, yeah. How do we do ethics without empathy? I feel like I don't get that.
Well, let's say for all of them, I would say, but in greater degrees or lesser degrees, certainly very pronounced in Hannah Arendt, this is the foundation of politics. We cannot make decisions together about a just world without having this capacity to endure the discomfort of what our world really is. Like that, this is the foundation. You're not going to go one step without, you don't even have a world to share unless you can begin to produce this. But then, of course, they have different ideas and often quite contrary ideas about what that just world would be like. But that their point is they're not, I mean, so Sontag might be more willing to declare what that is, certainly than Hannah Arendt, but they're trying to figure out what the foundations of a political and aesthetic world would be, but they're not prescribing it. They're very anti-utopian. To every single one of them is anti-utopian for lots of reasons, not the least of which is you can't actually know what's going to happen, that your actions in the world are just the world is too complex to know. But so that the morality in that case would be, so Arendt frequently used the metaphor of eggs and omelets, that you have to break a lot of eggs to make an omelet. Arendt would not at all be interested in breaking the eggs. Now, that doesn't mean she doesn't want to eat, but she didn't like this metaphor because it meant you could do unlimited damage in the service of the omelet, right? So she saw this as what happened with totalitarian states. That Nazi Germany, the promise was the master race. You could do anything. And she thought the same was true for the Soviet Union in the name of the workers' paradise, that those were the omelets. You could break any eggs at all because the goal at the end justified that. So she wants to get rid of that utopian thinking because it justifies tremendous violence and it doesn't necessarily lead anywhere. But that's not the point. The point for her is actually you couldn't possibly know that this is going to lead anywhere. And in the meantime, you can visit any disaster you want in the service of that goal. So all of them share in some ways that idea that that the first half of the century were utopian projects gone bad. Utopian projects that led to terror, that led to mass murder, because anything could be justified in light of the goal. So there's a lot of slowing down of those kinds of decisions, and sharing them not among a bureaucratic elite, but in a more democratic way, too. Yes, sir? Does that answer your question a little bit? Right. There's not a moral program, though. Yeah.
I think I might have a general question. Were they writing in a sense, do they have any altruism or purpose to their writing? In other words, I mean, yes, you can disconnect ethics from empathy, and you can objectify ethics, but is there a purpose? I mean, you say they're anti-utopian, but are they trying to improve humanity?
Oh, absolutely. Simone Weil's entire life is spent trying to improve the world. So she starts as a writer. So she was at the École Normale Supérieure, which is, pardon my really bad French, but is the one of the most elite schools in France. She graduated first in her class. There are very, very few women there. It's going to take me a while to answer this, but I'll get there. She was in the same class with Simone de Beauvoir. But she left school. When she graduated, there were no, obviously, professorships for her. She taught in high schools and lycées, but she spent all of her time as a leftist who was working on behalf of workers. She went to a Renault factory. One of her most beautiful and most famous essays is called Factory Work, and it comes from her years spent working in a Renault factory. She had migraine. She had very bad health. She had migraine headaches. She was actually very clumsy, and so factory work was all the more inhospitable to her. But she really wanted to understand what it was like for workers in the factory to devise a better political argument for what they needed. She was very certain that it was not just wages, that the work itself was damaging and dispiriting. I mean, people were injured all the time. I mean, but just the routine. So she writes a very eloquent essay of sort of the phenomenology of work. What does it feel like to go through the day? And she wrote all the time in leftist journals and was really around work and the place of work. She also wrote about farmers, laborers. In France, that you would use the word peasants, but like sort of the local ordinary laborers, and she was perpetually working on their behalf. Her most famous essay is an anti-war essay called The Iliad, or the Poem of Force, which is a magnificent essay. It's still in print today and still in McCarthy's translation today because they're stylistically similar. It worked really well. But she spent, her whole life was dedicated to what she thought was justice. So she didn't think that our job was to get rid of affliction, but it was never to be a party to it, that we had an obligation to make the world just and hospitable to others. But I mean, her entire career is about that. Certainly Hannah Arendt, I think, thought she was always writing with the purpose of intervening in world and U.S. politics. Her project to do the Eichmann trial is based on kind of new thing in the world, which is a term called genocide, and the idea of collective guilt and collective responsibility. So Eichmann was, for her, a historic moment in the history of justice and adjudication, because this was something novel. Now, his exact practices and duties were more definitively tied to, but I was just following orders kind of thing. She was really interested in what happens to guilt in the space of a totalitarian state. How do we even register guilt? And she was trying to give us the thinking tools to work out something like that. And in fact, sadly enough, those are really useful tools to have for the rest of the 20th century, because this isn't going to be the first or last time that you have to use them. So Mary McCarthy, it's funny, in the 40s or the 50s, and even maybe to some degree the 60s, you don't have to make an argument that an intellectual is trying to make a contribution to society, that activism wasn't the only way of trying to shape the political conversation around you or intervene in those kinds of things. I mean, McCarthy went to Vietnam and wrote about Vietnam. Certainly Sontag did, quite spectacularly. A Trip from Hanoi is one of her most notorious essays. Sontag was a huge part of the anti-war movement. I could go on. Didion, less so, certainly. Arbus was pretty apolitical, yeah. I mean, I think of it more of a moral project, an ethical project, than a political project.
Going back to Hannah Arendt and Eichmann, when I worked my way through there, or thought I had, what I understood was that she had defined evil in a different way.
That's very true. That's right.
In fact, Eichmann, before he went to trial, had already been judged because of the position he held. He was responsible. That was his job. That's what he did.
Right. You remember the phrase she used for that? Do you remember the phrase?
I don't right now. What was
the
it?
Banality of evil?
Oh, of course. Oh, that.
Right. So the point was, evil didn't have to have a monstrous face,
Well,
right?
exactly.
It could be a
That was-
bureaucrat,
yeah,
right?
Yeah, but already the story, the epochal story, had been written, or had been thought in the minds of the Jews, and particularly the Israelis, who had already stamped Eichmann with the evilest, one of the great evils. I mean, he was.
But they were putting him. But they still were putting him on trial, right? They didn't just execute him, for instance,
Well,
right? So why draw in the apparatus of the state? There were very big juridical questions at stake in Eichmann's trial.
Right.
And so she's interested in those. I mean, she's interested in many things. It's a very complex book, but you're right to point out that how we understand what evil is. So she says evil is not radical.
Exactly.
Right?
It's not a big thing you're making it.
Yeah.
And he's not that monster. I
Right.
think she left the trial. That is, like, I remember she went somewhere else to maybe listen to it, but she didn't want to watch it. She kind
But
of
she was there for quite a bit of it.
for quite a bit of the time,
Yeah.
but she didn't watch the whole thing.
Yeah.
Because she thought she got who Eichmann was.
And she also thought that it had become a show trial for,
Well, already proving a point.
right,
Decided.
the hours and hours in testimony
Right.
on the
I
camps.
thought that was so interesting.
Yeah.
The way that judgment, it's a profound judgment.
Right.
Is made whether you think of the person as an individual who's too weak, in a way, to really carry the weight you want to load on him.
Right, right. Yeah, that's right.
But it took them a long, long time to
Right.
come to that.
Right.
If they did.
Yeah. And she said that in some ways she felt a sense of exhilaration after the Eichmann trial because it freed her from some way she had of thinking about the camps. But she spent really much of the rest of her career trying to think about judgment, thinking. I mean, the last work of her life is remind me of the title. I'm getting very tired. No. The Life of the Mind, which is on judging, willing, and thinking. Right. So, but it's the thinking part that comes it really comes from the Eichmann trial, right? It really comes from that. How did he? What had gone? She said it wasn't not so. The other thing people objected to she was not saying it's his problem with his feelings. She didn't care about his feelings. She said the problem was with his thinking. What happened to his thinking that he could, that kind of moral blankness could take hold? And so then she's spending quite a lot of time trying to figure out what's wrong with thinking, what happens to thinking under duress, sort of as the way you were talking about it in the earlier question, like what happens to our thinking and how do we retain our capacity to think and make judgments? And this, she spends, really another decade to the end of her life trying to answer that question.
So as homework for this, I watched the Joan Didion documentary a couple nights ago. It's on Netflix. It's quite interesting. It's made by her husband, John Gregory Dunn's nephew, called Griffin Dunn,
Who's an actor.
who was himself an actor and a director. And if you know Martin Scorsese's After Hours, he's the main actor in After Hours, the one who's roaming around New York City. And he does a good job. He's not a boy anymore. He's 53 or something. But it's a good film. But what struck me about it was the involvement of Joan Didion and John Gregory Dunn in kind of celebrity culture. Mm-hmm. And kind of, we were talking about Frankfurt School media, but they're
in Hollywood writing film scripts.
They're in Hollywood.
Yeah,
they're
absolutely.
on Malibu.
And that's how they're making money.
Warren
actually.
Beatty has a crush on Joan Didion, always wants to sit next to her at dinner parties and so on. So that's a way, it seems to me, of differentiating your folks. Because Mary McCarthy is sort of a part of that, but Hannah Arendt definitely not. Simone
No,
Weil
I mean,
definitely not.
you have to think that from...
Sontag a little.
Sontag is, I have a lot of things to say about this. So Sontag is, but she's a media star in France. Like if you want to see like hours and hours of Susan Sontag on television, it's in France, not here. They thought she was amazing. So I did a little bit of collaboration, or I was a kind of sounding board or something for Nancy Cates, who did the Sontag documentary, which is also, I think, really good. But she turned up tons of, because Sontag always said she hated television, but she actually turned out to have been on television quite a bit, just not in the United States. So, so she's involved more in the arts and media world of Europe than she is of the United States, although she's photographed a lot.
Right.
And McCarthy spends from really the late 50s, early 60s in Paris, because she's married to someone in the diplomatic corps. So she's in Paris basically until she comes back in the early 70s. So she's back and forth. So she's a little bit out of that sphere. She's even out of the New York sphere because she's with her husband. But so Didion is really unlike, I mean, her intimacy with the world of film and Hollywood and mass media is really it's not comparable to anybody else. So yeah, I think it is a distinction. And of course, she writes. And she's always writing. She's going to the Doors, watch the Doors record something in the White Album.
Big fan of Jim Morrison.
She has
Yeah.
huge entree into those worlds. But she also started her career in New York. So I mean, it's
Yeah.
yeah.
All right, so I'm going to, okay, one more question.
Confused, and I have an underlying feeling that one cannot divorce ethics from empathy in the sense of a more modern use of the word. And as you mentioned the French writer,
Simone Weil, yeah.
Weil, she certainly practiced empathy by actually putting herself in the role of those workers. And I think Eichmann lacked empathy, and that's basically what a sociopath is. He has no feeling for the other person.
Well,
no
it's interesting.
connection to the other.
Simone Weil is really an interesting person. She has a very. You're right. It's an empathic act, but she was not. Like, she didn't do it through, let's say, an ethnography. She didn't ask them, how do you feel about this? What do you experience? She went and she said, it's like reporting from, an island of misery. Once you leave, you never look back. You can't report on it. So she went to the Isle of Misery herself because she didn't think the reports could be made. I mean, this is a little part of that essay. But she never advocates it. She's very, very wary of the hubris of empathy, right? That I'm empathizing with you. I mean, again, this sounds more like sympathy with the asymmetry of it, but you empathize with people who are in pain. That doesn't mean you're in pain, right? There is that asymmetry is there. She was extremely wary of, it's very interesting. She felt that only Christ had the supernatural grace that could allow that kind of attention, that humans were not capable of that, and that her goal was more to have them tell their stories than to empathize with them. I mean, Arbus says outright that she doesn't believe in empathy. Everyone else's tragedy is their own, is what she says, something like that. So I think in a more conventional way, or maybe more conventional understanding of empathy, Simone Weil is going to pretty much outright reject that as a kind of sop to your feelings of being able to care for someone else, as opposed to enabling them to have the voice and the care of themselves, like making a world that is just for that. So she writes a book called The Need for Roots at the end of her life, which is before the war ends, and it's a plan that was commissioned by de Gaulle and his people. She wasn't the only writer who did this, to prepare for France after the war. And so she says, right at the beginning, and this is a really interesting moment for her to make this comment, she's not interested in rights. France went the wrong way when they went with the rights of man, that we should be talking about obligations. And what are our obligations to the world that it would be criminal not to fulfill? So it's about building a world that allows that. I don't even go so far as to say flourishing, but it's about building that, sharing the project of building the world that does that, rather than being connected intimately or in some face-to-face way with laborers or
And that in the moment
whoever.
of the Human Rights Declaration, pretty much.
It's just before then, so it's quite interesting that rights were then coming to the fore. I mean, it's only, say, 4 years after that book that the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights will be signed by everybody. So nobody was listening to Simone Weil. So
In 1948. Debbie is also the editor of a brilliant volume of essays called Around 1948, which I also commend to your attention. A hearty thanks to Debbie for a wonderful presentation.
Thank you.